Welcome to the Mindful Monk series. I want to talk today about the rule of Saint Benedict and Saint Benedict's vision for monastic life, and there'll be several talks on this topic. I want to talk now because it's been such a seminal document, his rule. This is the size of it. It's mine is pretty bad, but 73 chapters, and it has had an enormous influence since it was not published, because it came out in, he wrote it in 480 as a manual for living community life. So there aren't too many organizations that are still operating all these years later. You know, it's over 1,500 years. It's unlikely that Ryanair or indeed Amazon or Google will be around in 1,500 years, yet there are still monasteries following more or less precisely what this rule lays out as for monks. Or he calls it a little rule for beginners. He doesn't say this is an advanced course, but I can tell you I'm still struggling after 50 years to follow this simple little rule for beginners. So I just wanted to introduce it today, and I'll come back to some of the key topics in it. Benedict, first of all, he grew up in Rome, just in the time when the Roman Empire was disintegrating. Morality had broken down, greed, sexual promiscuity, inequality, you know, it was just all falling apart. The empire had gone to their head and they'd lost their values, essentially. And Benedict, he was well educated, you know, he was kind of a well-to-do family, but he quickly realized the life that he was looking at was bankrupt and was never going to give him the life that he yearned for. He was convinced that he could find a life, and he first of all fled to the hills and became a hermit, lived on his own. And then after a few hiccups, people gradually came to be with him and looked to him to provide leadership. And as the numbers grew, he realized that he'd have to have some guidelines that would produce an alternative culture to the one he was witnessing in Rome and the Roman Empire. A culture which was designed specifically so that people could find life, and life in abundance. He wasn't interested in the Christian life. For him, as Jesus says, I come that you may have life and have it in abundance. Well, that was never going to happen in the Roman Empire. Sometimes I think that we're not too far off where the Roman Empire was when it started to go downhill. So it was all about designing a way of life, a culture, which is what culture means, that would ensure that those who joined would find life. And he envisaged that the only way that that could really happen was in community, working and praying together, supporting each other, that human beings couldn't do it really on their own. And his goal was that the measure for him was that people's hearts would enlarge with love. He says in the prologue to the rule, he says, as for him who is making progress in the religious life and in faith, his heart opens wide, and with the joy that's too great for words and which comes from love, he runs ahead in the way of God's commandments. So if it's working monastic life, then was meant to make our hearts increase. Any way of life is meant to do that, be it married or monastic life. I think we'd all agree that that's a valuable principle that we would want to work towards, that our hearts would open wide and it would have joy. These are meant to be part of the Christian vision. I often think, as I said, that the abbot should have a stethoscope and or couples should have a stethoscope and say, call us in once a year or however often, and see what state our heart is in. And if our heart is shrunk or shriveled up, then say, well, what's wrong? What am I not doing in my life, or what am I doing that's my heart is shriveling, or that is not expanding? So that was what his aim was. This is what his obsession was. And it's called a rule of Saint Benedict, the rule for monasteries. But it's not a rule as we think about it. It's not a list of do's and don'ts, you know. It's a carefully crafted program to ensure that we stay, as we age, full of sap still green. Sap should be flowing through us all as we age and finding life. That was the key. That was the key. So it's not, as I say, he does outlaw certain things and say certain things are good and certain things are not so good, but he has very few actually do's and don'ts. That's what the rule was, and as I say, it's lasted since 480. And I think a challenge to any of us is to think about, if you were to design a way of life that would make sure that people's hearts enlarged, that the sap kept flowing, that we didn't congeal and become hard or closed, what would the elements be of your rule, your guide for life? Because that's the ultimate thing that we have to come up with. And we really can't rely on society or the culture we're in to provide that, because the culture we're in is guided purely by financial considerations, you know, by the growth in the economy. There's nobody really talking about our people's hearts enlarging in Ireland today in the culture that we have created. So I leave you again with that question. What would be the central tenets of your rule for life if you were asked to write down your guidance for your heart enlarging and running with the unspeakable joy of love? What would get you there? Every blessing to you, and I'll see you next time.